Iran in utter terror. The night the IRGC headquarters came under siege. The night began like any other in Tehran, with the city's vast skyline glowing under artificial lights and a deceptive sense of normalcy lingering in the air. But beneath that calm surface, something extraordinary was unfolding. Within hours, Iran would find itself gripped by a level of fear not seen in decades, as reports began to emerge that the headquarters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, was under direct siege. For a nation that prides itself on military strength and internal control, this moment marked a terrifying psychological rupture. The IRGC has long been considered the backbone of Iran's power structure. More than just a military force, it operates as an intelligence agency, an economic powerhouse, and a political enforcer. Its headquarters symbolizes authority, resistance, and dominance. Any threat to it is not merely a tactical challenge, but an existential shock to the regime itself. That is why, when the first unconfirmed alerts surfaced, Iranian state media initially remained silent, attempting to suppress what could spiral into nationwide panic. Eyewitnesses near the heavily fortified zone reported unusual military movement shortly after midnight. Roads were abruptly sealed, communication signals weakened, and armed units rushed toward strategic locations. Residents described hearing distant explosions, followed by sustained gunfire echoing through the night. While officials labeled the sounds as routine security exercises, the scale and intensity told a very different story. Something had gone terribly wrong. As hours passed, encrypted messages leaked onto social media platforms, spreading faster than authorities could contain them. Claims suggested that the IRGC headquarters was surrounded, with multiple entry points compromised. Whether the attackers were foreign operatives, internal dissidents, or a coordinated hybrid force remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that the IRGC was not fully in control of the situation, a reality that sent shockwaves through Iran's political elite. Inside the corridors of power, panic quietly replaced confidence. Emergency meetings were convened at the highest levels of government, with senior commanders urgently reassessing national security protocols. Air defense systems were placed on maximum alert, and elite units were mobilized across Tehran and other major cities. The fear was not limited to physical damage. The real terror lay in what this siege symbolized. If the IRGC could be threatened at its core, then nowhere was truly safe. For ordinary Iranians, the atmosphere shifted rapidly from confusion to dread. Internet restrictions intensified. Foreign news channels were jammed, and messaging apps slowed to near uselessness. These measures, meant to maintain order, only deepened suspicion. People began stocking supplies, staying indoors, and whispering theories behind closed doors. Some feared a foreign strike. Others suspected an internal uprising long brewing beneath years of repression and economic hardship. Internationally, the silence from Tehran raised alarms. Global intelligence agencies scrambled to verify the reports, while regional powers closely monitored military movements. Any destabilization of Iran's command structure could have ripple effects across the Middle East. Oil markets trembled, diplomatic hotlines lit up, and speculation dominated global headlines. The possibility that Iran's most powerful military institution was under siege changed calculations overnight. As dawn approached, smoke was reportedly seen rising from restricted zones near the IRGC complex. Ambulances moved under heavy guard, and hospitals were placed on emergency status. Still, no official casualty numbers were released. The lack of transparency only fueled the growing sense of chaos. Analysts noted that Iran's refusal to address the situation directly suggested that the damage was far more severe than authorities were willing to admit. Within the IRGC itself, morale was shaken. The organization has built its reputation on the idea of invincibility, portraying itself as untouchable by enemies both foreign and domestic. This siege, whether brief or prolonged, shattered that illusion. Officers reportedly struggled to maintain command cohesion, while intelligence units raced to identify how such a breach could occur. The question haunting them was not just who attacked, but how deeply the threat had penetrated. By morning, Tehran was a city holding its breath. Streets were unusually quiet. Military checkpoints dominated major intersections, and an unspoken fear hung in the air. Iran was not just facing a security crisis, it was confronting a psychological turning point. The siege of the IRGC headquarters had exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored, and the consequences of that exposure were only beginning to unfold. This was not merely an attack on a building or an institution. It was a direct challenge to the image of control that the Iranian regime has cultivated for decades. Whether the siege ended swiftly or evolved into something far more dangerous, one truth had become undeniable. Iran had entered a moment of utter terror, and the aftermath would reshape its future in ways no one could yet fully predict. Chaos unfolds. Iran grapples with the siege of the IRGC headquarters. By mid-morning, the city of Tehran was in an almost surreal state. Civilians were peeking cautiously from behind curtains, wary of venturing outside. Traffic was minimal, limited to essential vehicles and military convoys. The sense of a nation under siege wasn't only literal, it was psychological. Fear had spread faster than any statement from the government could contain. People whispered rumors in hushed tones. Some claimed foreign agents had infiltrated the IRGC, while others insisted that an internal faction within the Revolutionary Guard itself had turned rogue. Whatever the truth, the image of the seemingly impregnable IRGC headquarters under threat had shaken Iran to its core. Inside the complex, security teams were scrambling to regain control. The compound, long considered one of the most fortified in the Middle East, had layers of reinforced walls, surveillance systems, and elite forces. Yet despite these measures, reports suggested that attackers had penetrated certain perimeter defenses. Officers worked feverishly, coordinating with special units stationed across the city, while trying to manage internal communication lines that had been partially disrupted. Commanders were reportedly issuing orders through secure channels, but confusion and conflicting reports slowed decision-making. Even a short lapse in discipline or response time could have catastrophic consequences in such a high-stakes environment. Meanwhile, intelligence networks across Iran were being pushed to their limits. Analysts examined satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and eyewitness accounts, trying to reconstruct what had happened and anticipate the next move. International observers were equally vigilant. If news of this attack spread unchecked, it could embolden opposition groups and inspire unrest in other regions. Iran's leadership understood that the situation was no longer just a military problem. It was a battle for control of public perception, a struggle to maintain the image of unshakable authority. Outside the headquarters, civilians reported a growing military presence across Tehran. Armored vehicles patrolled streets, while checkpoints monitored every major intersection. Drones flew overhead, capturing live feeds and scanning for suspicious activity. Helicopters circled the city skyline, their searchlights cutting through the hazy morning light. Despite these measures, anxiety persisted. Residents feared that the siege could escalate into a larger urban conflict, with the potential for widespread destruction. Every distant sound, an explosion, a helicopter, or a siren, triggered panic as people imagined the worst-case scenario unfolding nearby. Social media, despite government attempts to block access, became a critical tool for sharing updates. Videos surfaced of heavily armed personnel moving through city streets, of smoke rising from areas near the IRGC complex, and of ambulances transporting casualties. Some clips appeared authentic, others were likely fabricated or exaggerated, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. Tehran was gripped by a collective sense of vulnerability. Authorities responded with increased censorship, further limiting access to foreign news outlets and disrupting messaging apps. Yet every restriction seemed only to amplify fear, as citizens interpreted silence as confirmation of a crisis far worse than admitted. Political implications were equally significant. The IRGC has historically been both a military and political powerhouse within Iran. Its leaders wield influence over government decisions, economic enterprises, and internal security operations. The fact that its central headquarters was under siege suggested that no individual or institution was immune to disruption. High-ranking officials reportedly convened emergency sessions, evaluating contingency plans and preparing statements to reassure the public. But crafting the right message in the midst of such chaos was challenging. Any misstep could exacerbate unrest or embolden internal opposition groups. For the Iranian people, the events were both shocking and unprecedented. Many had grown accustomed to seeing the IRGC as untouchable, a symbol of strength and control. Now, that image was being shattered in real time. Fear gave way to speculation. Were internal factions clashing? Was a foreign operation underway? Could this be a prelude to civil unrest or regime destabilization? The uncertainty was as dangerous as any direct attack, because it eroded trust in the very institutions designed to protect citizens. Within the IRGC, reports indicated that command structures were under immense stress. Leaders attempted to maintain discipline, but morale had visibly declined. The presence of unknown assailants within striking distance of the headquarters exposed weaknesses in security protocols, prompting urgent reviews and emergency reinforcements. Officers coordinated with special forces units stationed outside the city, ready to intervene if the situation deteriorated further. Meanwhile, intelligence teams worked tirelessly to identify how the breach had occurred, knowing that even one miscalculation could allow attackers to exploit further vulnerabilities. International reactions were swift. Neighboring countries, global powers, and media outlets closely monitored the situation, analyzing satellite imagery and intercepted communications. Governments weighed potential interventions, sanctions, and diplomatic responses. Economists warned of oil market instability if the crisis escalated, while analysts cautioned that Iran's internal cohesion might be tested like never before. Tehran's silence created a vacuum, allowing speculation to dominate headlines and stoke anxiety abroad. The siege of the IRGC headquarters was no longer an internal security matter. It had become a geopolitical flashpoint. Amidst the chaos, ordinary citizens were forced to make rapid decisions. Schools and workplaces closed unexpectedly, while families huddled indoors, fearing that the conflict could spill into residential areas. Emergency protocols were activated, with hospitals preparing for potential casualties and essential services working under heightened alert. Citizens adapted to the new reality with a mix of caution and fear, understanding that the situation was fluid and that safety could no longer be assumed. Even daily routines, shopping, commuting, or checking in with relatives, were disrupted as anxiety and uncertainty dominated life in Tehran. By late afternoon, sporadic reports emerged suggesting that the siege had intensified. Explosions were heard at intervals, and smoke plumes were visible from several locations near the IRGC headquarters. Casualty numbers remained unconfirmed, further fueling fear and speculation. Analysts noted that the ongoing tension could have long-term effects on Iran's military and political posture. The credibility of the IRGC, the cornerstone of the regime's power, was under scrutiny. If it could be threatened, even temporarily, it exposed vulnerabilities that could not easily be repaired. Government attempts to manage communication faced immediate challenges, as social media and encrypted messaging allowed citizens to bypass traditional channels. Misinformation and disinformation spread rapidly, creating a complex environment in which perception was nearly as influential as reality. Tehran became a city not just under military stress, but under informational siege, where fear, rumor, and uncertainty amplified the impact of the physical confrontation. As night fell on the second day, the city remained on edge. The IRGC headquarters was still the focal point of uncertainty, and the question of resolution remained unanswered. Even if the siege were to end, the psychological and political repercussions would endure. Iran had witnessed its most powerful military institution challenged in a way that defied expectations. The events were a stark reminder that power, no matter how formidable, could never be assumed invulnerable. Tehran, and indeed the entire nation, stood at the edge of an uncertain future, grappling with fear, instability, and the unpredictable consequences of the siege. The siege deepens. Iran faces unprecedented turmoil. As the third day of the crisis unfolded, Tehran was a city transformed. The once bustling capital now resembled a war zone. Streets were largely deserted, punctuated only by armored vehicles and armed patrols. The IRGC headquarters remained the epicenter of the turmoil, but the effects of the siege rippled far beyond the complex's walls. Shops stayed closed, public transport operated at minimal capacity, and ordinary citizens moved cautiously, as if stepping through a field of uncertainty and fear. The psychological impact of the siege had now surpassed the immediate threat of physical violence, affecting every corner of Iranian society. Inside the headquarters, tension was palpable. Commanders worked under extreme pressure, attempting to coordinate defensive operations while simultaneously addressing intelligence failures that allowed the breach to occur. Reports suggested that attackers had used advanced tactics, exploiting weaknesses in both surveillance and perimeter security. Every decision carried life or death consequences. Communication lines were intermittently disrupted, leaving isolated units to act on limited information. Despite the chaos, the IRGC leadership insisted that control would be restored, though the growing uncertainty in lower ranks hinted at cracks in the institution's once unshakable cohesion. Meanwhile, civilians outside experienced the siege in real time. Smoke rising from the compound was visible for miles, and intermittent explosions echoed through neighborhoods. People feared that the conflict could spill into residential areas or escalate into full urban warfare. Emergency alerts on mobile networks urged citizens to stay indoors and avoid specific zones, though power outages and intermittent communication blackouts complicated compliance. The city was effectively in lockdown, and with every passing hour, the sense of normal life eroded further. Shops, schools, and offices remained closed, leaving families confined and dependent on limited supplies. Internationally, analysts and governments struggled to understand the full scope of the situation. Satellite images revealed activity within and around the IRGC complex that suggested prolonged engagement. Observers debated whether the attackers were a coordinated external force or internal dissidents exploiting systemic vulnerabilities. The ambiguity heightened global concern. Tehran's silence, compounded by its information blackout, made speculation rampant. Foreign governments began issuing travel advisories, urging citizens to avoid Iran, while neighboring countries increased border security, anticipating potential spillover effects. Inside Iran, political leaders convened in secret meetings to address both the immediate crisis and its long-term implications. The IRGC is not only a military institution, but also a critical political actor with influence over policy decisions, security operations, and economic enterprises. A breach of its headquarters was more than a security lapse. It was a symbolic defeat. Leaders understood that public perception was crucial. Any suggestion that the regime was vulnerable could embolden opposition groups and spark wider unrest. Crafting a careful narrative to maintain legitimacy became as urgent as the physical defense of the complex itself. For the Iranian people, fear was compounded by confusion and rumor. Social media, despite government attempts to suppress it, became the primary source of information. Videos showed heavily armed personnel moving through city streets, flashes of explosions near the compound, and smoke rising in multiple directions. While some reports were verified, others were misleading or deliberately fabricated, creating a chaotic information environment. Citizens struggled to discern reality from rumor, heightening anxiety. Even simple acts like going to the market or checking on relatives carried an air of risk and uncertainty. Inside the IRGC, internal divisions reportedly became more visible. Officers debated strategies for countering the attackers, while intelligence units analyzed every possible scenario. Some advocated for immediate aggressive action to reclaim control, while others stressed caution to avoid casualties and further escalation. The challenge was not only tactical but psychological. Maintaining discipline under extreme stress is difficult, and morale can deteriorate quickly if leadership appears indecisive. The siege had revealed vulnerabilities in what was long considered an impenetrable chain of command, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on all involved. The siege also forced Iran to reconsider broader security protocols. Satellite monitoring, internal communications, and intelligence coordination came under scrutiny, as analysts attempted to identify systemic weaknesses that had allowed attackers to threaten the IRGC headquarters. Discussions included potential reforms, reorganization of units, and new defensive measures. However, in the immediate term, the priority remained containment. Commanders mobilized reinforcements from other regions, including specialized units trained for urban operations. Helicopters and drones monitored the complex, ready to respond to any developments, while ambulances and medical teams were stationed nearby to handle casualties. The psychological impact on Tehran's citizens was profound. Even those living far from the IRGC complex experienced anxiety, as the perception of vulnerability spread across the city. People limited travel, stockpiled food and water, and checked in repeatedly with family members. The constant uncertainty eroded confidence in both safety and governance. For many, the siege became a symbol of fragility, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions can be threatened. Schools and workplaces remained closed, and life as it had been known was suspended. Residents were living in a state of heightened alert, unsure of when or how the crisis might end. Internationally, speculation continued to intensify. Analysts debated whether the attackers had external backing, were internal rogue elements, or represented a hybrid force exploiting vulnerabilities. Oil markets reacted to the uncertainty, and geopolitical tensions escalated. Regional powers monitored developments closely, understanding that any prolonged instability in Iran could have wider consequences for the Middle East. The siege had transformed a localized security incident into a crisis of international concern, with implications for diplomacy, trade, and regional alliances. By the end of the third day, the siege had entered a critical phase. While Iranian forces maintained perimeter control, reports indicated that pockets of resistance persisted within and around the IRGC headquarters. Sporadic gunfire and explosions continued, and smoke was still visible rising from the complex. Officials offered only limited information, heightening both domestic and international concern. Citizens watched from afar, fearing the escalation of violence and hoping for a resolution that seemed increasingly uncertain. In this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, the siege of the IRGC headquarters had become more than a security incident. It had evolved into a symbol of vulnerability, a test of resilience, and a challenge to authority. Iran, long perceived as a formidable military and a political power, was confronting an event that exposed its susceptibility to disruption. The coming hours would determine not only the outcome of the immediate crisis, but also the psychological and political consequences that would shape the nation for years to come. The siege had revealed one undeniable truth: power and security, no matter how carefully constructed, can be fragile. And in a city like Tehran, where history, politics, and military might intersect, the ramifications of such fragility could be felt far beyond the walls of the IRGC headquarters. Citizens, commanders, and leaders alike faced a shared reality, uncertainty, danger, and the urgent need to adapt to an unprecedented challenge. The siege had changed Iran in ways both immediate and enduring, and the nation would never be the same again. Resolution and aftermath. Iran's IRGC siege ends. As the fourth day dawned, Tehran was still under a tense, almost unbearable silence. The once bustling city had been paralyzed by fear, its people trapped between uncertainty and hope. The siege of the IRGC headquarters had lasted longer than anyone expected, testing the limits of Iran's military and intelligence apparatus, as well as the patience of its citizens. Reports suggested that reinforcements from across the country had finally arrived. bolstering the elite units already stationed around the complex. The attackers, whether foreign or domestic, were being slowly contained, but the threat had already left a deep mark on the nation's psyche. Inside the IRGC headquarters, commanders worked tirelessly to regain complete control. Surveillance drones monitored every corner, while specialized units cleared each building systematically. There were intermittent clashes, but progress was evident. Officers coordinated evacuations for wounded personnel and worked to secure sensitive documents and intelligence that had been at risk. Every room cleared, every hallway secured, symbolized not just the physical reclamation of territory, but a gradual restoration of confidence in an institution that had been publicly challenged for the first time in decades. The civilian population, meanwhile, experienced a mixture of relief and ongoing anxiety. Smoke still lingered in parts of the city, and the sounds of sporadic gunfire reminded everyone of the recent chaos. Yet the visible return of military patrols and the gradual reopening of streets gave citizens cautious optimism. Families ventured outside, checking on neighbors, and life slowly resumed in a city that had experienced near-total lockdown. Shops and schools reopened in phases, though the memory of the siege remained fresh, shaping the way people interacted, traveled, and viewed authority. International observers praised the measured response by Iranian forces while continuing to analyze the broader implications of the incident. The siege had demonstrated both vulnerabilities and resilience within Iran's military structures. While the immediate threat was contained, questions lingered about the origins of the attack and the lessons that could be learned to prevent future breaches. Analysts noted that the psychological impact on both the Iranian leadership and the public could influence political decisions, internal reforms, and military strategies for years to come. Within the IRGC, introspection followed swiftly after the crisis. Senior commanders conducted reviews of security protocols, evaluated the chain of command, and analyzed intelligence failures. The breach had exposed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored, prompting discussions about training, surveillance systems, and emergency preparedness. The goal was clear: to prevent any future challenge from shaking the organization's image of invincibility. Officers also emphasized communication strategies to ensure that, in a future crisis, both personnel and civilians would be informed and reassured without creating panic. The political implications of the siege were equally profound. Leaders recognized that maintaining public confidence was critical. While the event had exposed vulnerabilities, the narrative of a contained threat and swift response helped stabilize the situation. State media began highlighting the bravery of IRGC forces and the rapid measures taken to restore control. This narrative was aimed at reinforcing the perception of authority, demonstrating that, despite temporary disruptions, the state remained strong and capable. Managing perception, in many ways, became as important as managing the siege itself. For ordinary Iranians, the experience was transformative. People had witnessed firsthand that even the most secure institutions could be challenged, creating a new awareness of both danger and resilience. Citizens were more vigilant, cautious, and aware of the fragility of the systems around them. The siege had left psychological scars, but it had also inspired stories of courage, resourcefulness, and community solidarity. Individuals who had stayed indoors, helped neighbors, or simply maintained calm in the face of uncertainty became part of the broader narrative of survival and resilience. As the day progressed, reports confirmed that the last pockets of resistance had been neutralized. Explosions ceased, smoke cleared, and the IRGC headquarters gradually returned to a controlled state. Commanders emphasized that while the siege was over, vigilance must remain high. Security measures across Tehran were strengthened, with a focus on early detection, rapid response, and public safety. Citizens were encouraged to return to their routines while remaining aware of potential threats, underscoring the delicate balance between normalcy and preparedness. The aftermath of the siege sparked discussions that extended far beyond Tehran. Analysts, journalists, and citizens debated how such an attack could have occurred, what it meant for Iran's political and military future, and how public trust in institutions might be affected. Lessons were drawn about communication, emergency preparedness, and the importance of both internal and external intelligence. The incident became a case study in crisis management, illustrating that even in nations with powerful militaries, threats, both real and perceived, can challenge stability and provoke widespread fear. In the final analysis, the IRGC siege demonstrated the dual nature of crises. While physical security was ultimately restored, the psychological and political dimensions persisted. Iran had faced a moment of profound vulnerability, and while the immediate danger was over, the impact of the event would shape strategies, policies, and public perception for years to come. The nation had survived, but the experience reminded everyone that vigilance, resilience, and adaptability are essential in a world where even the most formidable institutions are not impervious to threat. As Tehran slowly returned to its routines, citizens, commanders, and leaders alike reflected on what had transpired. The siege had been a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of conflict, the fragility of perception, and the critical importance of preparedness. The IRGC had endured, the city had survived, and the nation had faced one of its most extraordinary challenges in recent memory. But the lessons learned would continue to resonate, shaping policy, strategy, and public consciousness long after the final explosion had faded. Thank you for watching this detailed coverage of the IRGC siege in Tehran. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest developments and in-depth analyses. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss any updates from our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you important news stories from around the world. Stay informed, stay safe, and thank you for being part of our community.